Grab your scissors and supplies. Today we're making the Hello Gorgeous wall hanging. For the front of this wall hanging, you will need a light, a medium, and a dark fabric that coordinate. You will also need an old pair of blue jeans that you can cut up or a fabric that you can make pockets out of. We are going to cut our center piece of fabric, our light fabric, 12 inches by 24 inches long. A directional fabric or a fabric with a large print that's tone on tone works really well for the center of this wall hanging. For your inner border, your medium tone fabric, you will need 2 strips cut the length of your fabric that are 1.5 inches wide. Each of your strips will need to be about 40 inches long. For our outside border, our dark fabric, we are going to cut 2-inch strips. If your dark fabric is 45 inches wide, with the selvage on, you will need to cut 2 strips that are 2 inches wide. If your fabric is shorter than this, you will need to cut 3 strips that are 2 inches wide. We are going to start this project by sewing our medium strips, our inner border, to our center fabric. I like to sew the border on the length of my fabrics first. I used 1/4 inch seam allowance for all seams in this project, but it really doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. When you're laying out these strips, try not to have too much overhang on the top where you're starting to sew. The reason being is we have 2 strips of fabric cut for the inner border, and we want to use each strip for a length and a width of the fabric. Once you've sewn your strips on, you'll want to trim them. We are going to finger press our seams to the outside and iron them. Once we've pressed our seams outwards, we're going to sew on the top and the bottom inner border. We'll iron our seams toward the outside of the panel. We'll square up our corners and cut off the extra fabric. When sewing on the sides of your outside border, you're going to have to be somewhat conservative with your fabric. Once you cut off your salvages, you need at least 42 inches of usable fabric to get 2 sides out of 1 strip. If each strip started out at 45 inches, this is doable, but there's not a lot of wasted fabric. I started by sewing my outside borders on the length of my fabric first. As before, you'll iron your seams towards the outside of the panel. We are going to trim off our extra border fabric. If you started out with a piece of fabric that was at least 45 inches wide, you'll end up with a piece of fabric left over that's just big enough to do one more side. If you cut a 3rd strip of fabric for the outside border, you will use it for your top and bottom. As before, we'll iron all of our seam allowances to the outside of the panel. Now that our borders are done, we'll prepare a quilt sandwich. You will need a piece of fabric for the back of your panel that is about 20 inches by 32 inches. If you know you'll be free motion quilting and you think you need more fabric, by all means add it. Your back fabric does not have to be cut perfectly because you'll be trimming it off later and discarding it. Once you have your back fabric cut out, you'll want to cut a piece of batting that is about the same size. You'll want to smooth out all your wrinkles. And then we'll place the front of our wall hanging on top of our batting. You'll want to smooth out all your wrinkles and line up your panel. Once you have it smoothed out, you'll want to take it to the ironing board and iron it in place. I used a few safety pins to keep my quilt sandwiched together. From here, you'll want to take it to the sewing machine and do some top stitching. You can do straight line stitching or free motion quilting. It really doesn't matter. Just something decorative and to keep the batting in place. Once you've finished doing your top stitching, you'll want to trim off the extra batting and the backing. Check your panel to see if it's square. I usually do this just by bringing the bottoms together to see if they're the same width, and then I bring the sides together to see if they're the same length. If they're not, I look where I can make a little trim and correct it so that they're the same dimensions. From here, we're going to sew the pockets on. For the pockets, you can either use an old pair of jeans or you can use my pattern to make pockets from scratch. We will start with using old jeans. It's the quickest way to get pockets on this panel. You could use a seam ripper to take the pockets off the pants, but I wouldn't suggest that because you'll lose the top stitching, or you could lose the top stitching on your pockets, and we don't want to do that. Plus it takes too long. It's best to just go at it with a pair of scissors. When you're cutting the pockets off your jeans, cut at a slight angle so that the scissors are going slightly under the folded edge of the pocket. Cutting this way will conceal the raw edge that you're cutting off. Don't cut too far in because then you'll be cutting the top stitching on the pocket. Once you've cut the pocket off of your jeans, you really don't need the inside to the pocket, or what would be the back of the pants. So we're just going to cut that out and it'll reduce some bulk in our panel. Once you have your pockets all cut out, you'll pin them to the front of your panel and you'll stitch around the edges, back stitching at the beginning and at the end. So if you have no spare pants, no worries, we'll just make our own pockets. I have a free pattern in the description box of this video if you just want to print it off, cut it out and trace it, or you can just trace a pocket out of one of your existing pants. So for the pockets, you'll need a piece of fabric for the front of the pocket and a piece of fabric for the lining. And you're going to be making two pockets. You need two fronts, two backs. You will just sew right sides together for these pockets, about a 1/4 inch seam, and you'll leave an opening for turning the pocket right side out. We'll clip off our corners so that we can turn these right side out and get nice pointed corners. We will turn our pockets right side out. We will give the pockets a good ironing and we'll tuck under our raw edges on our opening. After we've ironed our pocket, we want to sew across the top of our pocket. For my pocket, I wanted it to have double seams just like regular jean pockets. I sewed 2 seams with contrasting thread across the top of my pocket and 1 seam all around my pocket. When I sew my pocket to the front of the wall hanging, I'll use the same contrasting thread and I'll get my second row of stitching around the outsides of the pocket. Once you have your pockets stitched the way you like them, you'll want to pin them to the front of your wall hanging. As for where to pin your pockets, that's up to you. You want to decide what you're going to put in your pockets. If you're going to put something tall in each pocket, you might want them spaced further apart. If you're not really planning on using them for anything, you could just center them. It's up to you on how you're going to use the wall hanging. I thought about some ways to use the wall hanging, and I thought maybe you could use it to put tickets in the pockets, like if you have season tickets for a game or a show. You could put envelopes in it, stuff that has to go in the mailbox or be mailed out. There could be birthday cards put in it that you're going to mail out, or you could use it for Valentine's cards, Christmas cards, whatever, or you could stick flowers in it like I did in the front of the video. Once you have decided the placement of your pockets, you'll want to take it over to the sewing machine and sew your pockets on the panel. You'll want to backstitch at the beginning and the end so that the pockets are strong. To finish up our quilt, we need to put some kind of binding on the edges, and I've decided to take a shortcut for mine. I purchased this bias tape. It's extra wide double fold. It's a 1/2 inch wide and there's 3 yards of it. It ends up being just enough to do this wall hanging. If you're not familiar with bias tape, it's really easy to use. This is double folded and you just put the layers of your quilt sandwich in between the fold of the bias tape and sew one seam holding the bias tape on. It really cuts your work down when it comes to making your own binding. Before we sew the binding on though, we have to think about how we're going to hang our quilt. I usually do the small quilt with these little corner triangles that will hold a rod or piece of wood. To make these little rod pockets, you're just going to cut 2 2.5 inch squares, fold them in half diagonally and iron them. Find the top of your quilt and pin one triangle in each corner, raw edges to raw edges. We're going to sew these in the binding, so we have to have them in place before we sew our binding to the top of the quilt. Once we have them pinned or clipped in place, we can start sewing on the binding. When sewing this bias tape on, you want to leave about a 4-inch tail. So you want to start sewing about 4 inches from the bitter end and backstitch, and then continue on with a straight stitch, tucking in all layers of your quilt sandwich and any frays you might have. You want to sew a straight stitch down the side of your binding close to the edge towards the inner part of your quilt, and you'll want to check the back to make sure you're catching the back of the bias tape as you're sewing. To do the corners, you'll want to sew all the way to the edge of your side, right to the edge of the panel. From here, you'll open up your bias tape and you'll find the center of your bias tape, and you'll place that center right on the edge of your panel, lining it up and tucking in all layers. You're going to fold the corner at 45 degrees and bend it over top itself. You're going to check both sides of this because you'll want a 45-degree angle on the front and the back. This is really easy to do and you end up with a really nice corner. Once you have the corner folded as you like, you'll need to get it under the sewing machine without unfolding it, and then you'll just sew straight down the side until you get to the next corner. When you get to your upper corners, double check to make sure you have those little rod pockets tucked in the bias tape. You will want to continue sewing till you come back around to where you started, and you're going to want to stop sewing about 7 or 8 inches from where you started and backstitch. So with this opening that you have, you want to take one end of your bias tape, a bitter end of your bias tape, to about the center of this opening, and you want to take that bias tape and you want to fold it back so that right sides are together and pin it into place. Now you want to take the other piece of binding bias tape and have it come to the piece that you just folded. Fold it back on itself and have them just touching. You want to mark this spot where they touch. This is going to be your sew line. You're going to sew these together, right sides together. After you have marked where they meet, you are going to unpin them and you are going to trim them to about 1/4 inch from your marking. This will be your seam allowance, so if you want a little more seam allowance, leave a little more on there, but you are going to sew on the line that you marked. Now you're going to turn the two ends so that right sides are together and your marked lines are matching, and you are going to sew them together on the line that you marked. If you have marked it correctly and you have sewed on your marked line, it should fit perfectly when you lay this out. There should be no stretching or pulling or puckers. You will want to open up your seam allowance and sew your binding in place. Well, that's it. You have finished it and it looks gorgeous. Give yourself a pat on the back for trying something new, and if you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you very much.